Good morning, everyone. My name's Scott Power. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences at USQ. And the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences has approximately 20 staff based in Southeast Queensland, Melbourne and the United Kingdom. And our main focus is to help people manage some of the risks they face from climate variability and climate change, and to help them seize any associated opportunities. And in order to do this, we conduct research, training, extension, product co-design and co-development, monitoring, evaluation and adoption. And in addition to that 20 staff, we also have an additional 10 part-time staff who called Climate Mates, who work right across Northern Australia, and they act as champions, advisors and consultants in the use of meteorological and climate science in decision making. And we also have approximately 15 PhD students, most of those in Australia, but some in Southeast Asia. But before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to, on behalf of USQ, acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather, and in my case, stuck in Melbourne, it's the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung and the Bunurong people. And we would also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Jason Evans. And Jason is a professor at the Climate Change Research Centre at UNSW in Sydney. And he's one of the world's leading experts on dynamical downscaling. And he's also an editor of the Journal of Climate and a member of the Science Advisory Team and Coordinated Research Climate Downscaling Experiment, cordex, which is an element of the World Climate Research Program. Jason is also an expert in the science of climate systems, particularly in regard to land-ocean interactions, the water cycle, and especially regional climate change. And his research involves general issues of water cycle processes over land, how we can change them, largely through changes in land use and changes in climate. And today, Jason is going to be talking about dynamical downscaling. What is it good for? Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Scott.
Sorry, Jason. And at the end, after Jason's spoken, we're going to have a Q&A session. And I'll pass over to Louis and Kate back at USQ. So if you have any questions during Jason's presentation or immediately after it, please put them into the Q&A slot on the session. Thanks very much. Sorry, Jason.
No worries. Okay, hopefully you can see my presentation now.
Yep.
So, hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'll start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Gadigal land here in Sydney. And I'm going to talk about dynamical downscaling and say a bit about what it is, why we might do it. I'll introduce the Cordex program, international program, and we'll talk a bit about strengths and limitations before looking at what is available for our region and look at some examples of how this sort of data is being used. So what is downscaling? So downscaling is to derive local or regional scale information from large scale conditions, okay? The assumption here, of course, is that large scale conditions are exhibiting an influence on our local and regional scales. Now, that's true to some extent, basically everywhere around the globe. It's possibly a bit less true, perhaps in the tropics, where you've got a lot of strong local forcing, and more true in the extratropics, where you have influence of the sort of global storm track systems and so on. So why would we want to do this? So to start with, the climate system is global by its nature. And so we use global climate models to model that system in its entirety. Current GCM spatial resolutions are still on the order of hundreds of kilometers. And that means that, you get situations like you can see here, New Zealand's just a few grid cells. Tasmania is sort of there as a grid cell. In this case, Sydney and Canberra look like they're in the same grid cell. So to the global model, we have the same climate. Papua New Guinea and Australia connected. There's no Pacific Islands in the global models. So, there's an analogy with a camera's resolution. And really, if you want to know what's going on in a particular place with any detail, then you can't really get that from global models. And of course, if we want to use this information to help us make decisions about a particular thing, then we need information that accounts for the specificities of that location at the scale that we want to make this decision, right? So if you're trying to decide about whether to invest in some asset, build a bridge, anything like this, then you want to know about what's happening at that place where you want to do that thing. And that has to account for local topography and land use and the conditions around that area, which you can't really get from global models. Okay, so we need to translate that large scale information from global models down to our area of interest to help us make decisions. And we know that global models can't always get important aspects of the climate that will affect our decisions. So here's a figure from a paper. This is focused on Europe, but this gives you an example of how some things look different when we model them at different scales. So in this case, the green dots here show the observations of precipitation at different intensities. So the x-axis is showing you the intensity of the daily precipitation. And then the black dots here are showing you what that intensity looks like from a GCM. So the GCM has a resolution of a couple of degrees, and you can see it doesn't represent the extreme precipitation end of the distribution really at all. So if you're trying to make a decision where your risks are associated with extreme precipitation, then the GCMs aren't very helpful. Then we've got in the blue, we've got downscaled, we're using regional climate models to about 50 kilometer resolution, and then in the red, downscaled to about 12 kilometers resolution. So what you can see is that, you really need to get to 12 kilometer resolution or so before you're adequately representing that observed distribution, especially towards the extreme end of the rainfall. But even at 12 kilometers, there's errors associated with that, and it tends to lean on the underestimation side. Nevertheless, this is a nice example of how you can improve the type of information you're getting by doing downscaling. And that can help when we're talking about dealing with climate risk and decision making. So that's kind of from a user perspective why you might want to do downscaling. From a climate scientist perspective, I'm really interested in being able to simulate various climate phenomena. The climate system is a connected system, so the large scales of the climate system are affecting the small scale phenomena that occur, but the small scale phenomena are also feeding back on the large scales as well. So it's a continuum, and it's kind of artificial that we break the scales up, largely because of the limitations we have with computational power and so on. What I'm showing here is a figure from the recent IPCC assessment report. And here they've put lots of different weather and climate phenomena into the figure based on the spatial and temporal scales relevant for those phenomena. And then you can also see boxes representing the types of spatial and temporal scales represented by different models. So you've got GCMs up in the top right corner there, getting the very large scale phenomena, RCMs able to capture some of the sort of middle phenomena there. But then you need to get to CRMs, or cloud resolving models, or UC models, which are urban canopy models, to capture these really small scale weather and climate phenomena. So that RCM box, gives you a fair representation of the types of regional climate model data available to you right now. The next generation, which we're already working towards, is going to be covering this kind of box that you can see in the dotted green box here, such that we'll be reaching resolutions where we're incorporating a lot of the phenomena that previously needed cloud resolving models for going forward. So I think we're going to be, the next step for the regional climate modeling is going to be including a lot more of these quite important local meteorological and climate phenomena going forward. All right. So it's really a matter of scale. If what you're interested in is sort of what's happening in the global context, or even at the scale of whole continents, then GCMs are the tool to look at. If what you're interested in is really a regional level or local level, then you really need to be looking at some downscaling approaches to get information that's worth, that's relevant or useful at those regional and local scales. Okay, so hopefully you can see why I think, at least, that downscaling is an important activity that we need to be doing. And now I'm going to tell you about cordex. So this is quite important, I think, in terms of international progress in downscaling. So cordex stands for the Coordinated Regional Climate Downscaling Experiment, and it's sponsored by the World Climate Research Programme. And in many ways, you can think of cordex as the sister, maybe little sister, to the CMIP global model programs that are also WCRP sponsored. So in cordex, they have a coordination of downscaling of CMIP family simulations, coordinating groups from all around the world for specific domains. And with the stated aim of trying to produce data that's available and usable for vulnerability impact and adaptation communities to do their work. So there's three main activities that cordex does. The first is to do this coordination around downscaling of CMIP scenario experiments. The next is to coordinate experiments to try and improve our knowledge of the regional climate phenomena and how we model them. And they do this largely by addressing what we call the cordex scientific challenges, and through projects known as flagship pilot studies. Now there's a whole suite of these now, I think 12 or 15 different flagship pilot studies that are looking specifically at various aspects of the climate system at regional scales. So if you are interested, all of this work coordinated through cordex uses an open model, so you can always get involved if you want to be involved in running experiments, or you can get involved if you want to just get access to the data to do some analysis of your own. And the last thing they do is around capacity building and guidance, writing guidance documents and so on. So just a few words about the cordex scientific challenges. So these are split into 5 clear challenges and 4 cross-cutting themes. You can see them here. Here, added value is really talking about how we can quantify whether the downscaling is adding value to the global model projections. And human element is referring to bringing in specific human changes to the system into the modeling. So that could be everything from specifically modeling the urban environment to including reservoir and dam operations or irrigation areas, that kind of thing. Regional couple modeling here is referring to bringing in regional seas or local ocean circulations into these models. So all the models include atmosphere and land, but here we're also including ocean. Precipitation systems and local wind systems are a major focus of the cordex efforts. And then you can see the cross-cutting challenges there. And all of this is in the context of trying to bring some coordination to the international community who is looking at these various aspects in different parts of the world. Okay, so that's cordex. It'll come up a few more times as we go forward in my talk. But first, let's just think a little bit about how we do downscaling in practice. So here's another figure that I've taken from the recent IPCC report, and they've developed this flow chart for the various ways downscaling can occur. So we always start from our global models at the top here, and then we can downscale with dynamical downscaling. So that's using regional climate models. And then we can take that output and then we can use some statistical approaches to do bias adjustment or further statistical downscaling to get at our target variable at our location of interest. You can also skip the dynamical downscaling and go straight from GCMs with statistical methods to try and do that. There's various reasons why that's probably not quite going to give you the answer you're after, and this dynamic downscaling step is going to be quite important. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus just on this dynamical downscaling step in the downscaling process here. Having said that, these models are not perfect. There's always some errors or biases that remain after dynamical downscaling. And if you want to do applications to look at impacts and stuff, many systems have nonlinear relationships or thresholds for various variables in terms of the impacts and when they occur. So adjusting for or accounting for those errors through some sort of bias adjustment or something is generally needed after a dynamical downscaling before you do some sort of impacts work with the data. And so that is a normal part of the downscaling procedure. Okay, so a little bit about dynamical downscaling with regional climate models. There's a few ways this can be done. Here I'm specifically talking about using a limited area regional climate model. And the setup looks a bit like this. So you have a global model that gives us this low resolution climate for the globe. And then we take our area of interest here and we model this at much higher resolution, but we take information from the global model at our boundaries. And so we have a process at the boundary. This is where the outer part of the boundary is the climate as the GCM sees it. And then this is blended with the solution from the regional climate model in a zone near the boundary, often referred to as the relaxation zone. So when I show in coming slides results from the downscaling, I'm only going to talk about the results in the interior here. So this is where the result is purely by solving the regional climate model and doesn't include this boundary zone where we're getting the information from the GCM into the regional climate model. But that is an important part of doing this kind of downscaling, is that we're using the boundary conditions from the global models. Now, regional climate models are similar to GCMs in many ways. So fundamentally, they're solving the same set of primitive equations. So conservation of mass, momentum, energy, the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere and ocean. They provide data that's coherent spatially and temporally and consistent across meteorological variables. So it's solving for the whole climate system together. So it's all the variables, climate-related variables are being solved for together, and it's being solved across all grid points in the domain and at every time step in the model, which for an RCM might be anything from seconds through to minutes as a time step. Now, like GCMs, there are climate processes that occur at scales smaller than the resolution of our grid, and we need to parameterize those processes. So in this example here, the RCM is using a resolution of 10 kilometers. So it's what its terrain representation looks like at that resolution. Now, of course, at 10-kilometer resolution, you're not explicitly seeing or resolving the transition of atmospheric water vapor into cloud droplets, into rain droplets or ice crystals or snow. So that sort of cloud microphysics processes still have to be parameterized in the regional climate model, much the same way or a similar way to they're parameterized in global climate models. Okay, so keep that in mind. Even at these higher resolutions, there's still climate processes that need to be parameterized in these models. But they also differ from the global models in a number of important ways. So one is that the regional models are using non-hydrostatic Euler equations. And this is really important when you get to higher resolution. The hydrostatic assumption is no longer true. The GCMs use the hydrostatic assumption because at those GCM resolutions, it is basically true, and it actually saves a lot of computational time if you can make that assumption. But with the regional models, we don't make that assumption. So our solutions cost more computationally, but are a more realistic representation of the behavior of the atmosphere. The regional models, of course, are not self-contained tools like GCMs are. So GCMs solve the global climate system, and they're self-contained in a way by doing that. But the regional models, as I already mentioned, need to have boundary conditions coming from a global model. And of course, the regional models integrate the equations over this limited area, but at higher resolution. And that higher resolution, because we're solving this using numerical approximations on a grid, going to higher resolution automatically gives us smaller truncation errors compared to the global model. So we automatically get that benefit of going to higher resolution. We get a more accurate solution for these equations. Now, of course, going to higher spatial resolution means we also need to increase our temporal resolution. And so that means that if we double our resolution, our computational requirement doesn't increase by 4, it increases by more like 8 or maybe 10, because we have this increase in or decrease in time step, as well as the increase in spatial resolution. Okay, so what are some strengths of regional climate models? Well, I've sort of mentioned these already. They're solving the principal equations for the whole climate system, so they're physically consistent, and they're based on those physical principles, at least for the processes resolved. We're at higher resolution, so we're including local forcing down to the resolution of the model. So you can think of this as, better representing coastlines and land cover types and topography, all that sort of local forcing. We have full spatial and temporal coverage, so we're solving for the entire grid all the time. So it doesn't depend on where we have observations. And we're solved for all kinds of variables. So all the climate system is being solved for at the same time. So we have variables that represent all different parts of the climate system available from these models, including variables that aren't very well observed, which can be very useful. Another strength of regional climate models is that they allow us to explore and understand individual processes. So because they are solving these primitive equations and the basis of our understanding of how the climate system works, we can use them to run experiments to investigate in detail how various local circulations work, or how they might change with climate change, understand what large-scale drivers are impacting these local processes. We can do experiments where we explicitly change factors that are related to human intervention. So land cover changes, deforestation, you can do deforestation experiments, you can do experiments looking at how changes in the urban environment impact the local climate, all those kinds of things. So they're really quite flexible tools to help us improve our understanding of the climate system itself. And in this case in particular, understanding of local or regional factors that are important in the climate system itself. So by improving our understanding, we can also improve our confidence in the projections that we might produce using these kind of tools as well. But of course, there are limitations to these regional climate models. And the first ones and the largest one is probably that they're very computationally expensive and they generate huge amounts of data. So you really need supercomputers and large data environments to run these models to do climate projections, and then to analyze the outputs that we get from these models. And that's probably the biggest single limitation with these models. And of course, there are still discrepancies between the spatial scale of the regional models and any site-specific data you might need for an impact study. So the models aren't perfect, they still have errors, so you probably still need some sort of statistical bias correction to apply to the data before you use it for an impact study type of work. It's related to that is the fact that we still have subgrid scale processes that we have to parameterize, like the cloud microphysics as an example. And some of these things, in some of these parameterizations, there's parameters that aren't very well constrained. And there's even some processes that are not very well understood. A result of this is that we have, in the international community, we have many different parameterizations for the same set of processes produced. So for instance, for cloud microphysics, there's many different cloud microphysics parameterizations that have been produced by different groups around the world. They are structurally different, so they take different approaches to trying to solve for those things. And by comparing how they represent clouds and the changes in clouds going forward, it gives us some understanding of the level of uncertainty we have in those processes and how those uncertainties might be impacting our climate projections. And last limitation I mentioned here is that these models are quite expertise demanding and technically challenging. They aren't the kind of models that you take out of the box and you run by pressing a button. There's lots of things you need to do to set these models up and to run them successfully, and to run them well and in ways that are really useful depending on the objective that you're trying to use them for. So there's probably the sort of things that not anyone can run on their own, laptop or anything like that. And there's coordination between groups with this kind of expertise around the world through programs like Cordex. Okay, so let's have a bit of a look now at what regional climate projections data is available for Australia. And I'll say a few words about Pacific, but not a lot. So we'll start with Cordex. It is the main international coordination around producing these projections. The data that's available right now is largely downscaling of the CMIP5 global projections. On the right here, I'm showing you a map of the Cordex Australasia domain, which is more or less centered over Australia. Includes New Zealand and Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, but you can see it includes many Pacific islands, but not all. So it cuts off in the northern hemisphere. So there's some islands outside to the north, and there's some islands outside to the east as well. But this is the Cordex domain that contains the most of the Pacific islands. There's 14 Cordex domains that cover all land areas of the globe. So if you're interested in somewhere else in the globe, there's a Cordex domain that covers that. I'm just going to talk about this Australasia domain today. You can see some information about the downscaling protocol here. Essentially, we're downscaling CMIP5 GCMs to resolutions of 50 or 25 kilometers. And these are continuous, usually from 1950 through to 2100. And the scenarios that have been downscaled are shown here. So the RCP scenarios, 8.5, 4.5, and 2.6. Not all of those scenarios are downscaled by all models and modeling groups. Probably RCP 8.5 is the future scenario with the most number of projections or simulations contributing to that ensemble. So this data is available right now. You can go to the Earth System Grid Federation I put a link there, but you can just Google the ESGF. And it's the same platform through which the CMIP data is distributed. And you'll find the cordex data for all the various cordex regions around the world through those portals. If you go there today, I think you'll find one or two more simulations that I'm showing here, but the Cordex Australasia simulations are shown here. They've been built using this set of regional climate models, so 6 different regional climate models, and they're downscaling 11 different CMIP5 GCMs shown there. So the green squares show the combinations of which regional model has downscaled which global model. And I think here I'm showing a 20-member ensemble or 19-member ensemble. There's still some simulations getting added to this ensemble, so I think we have just over 20 members in this ensemble now if you have a look today. But that's a 20-member ensemble, so that's quite good. We've got, that allows us to quantify the level of confidence we might have in some changes or areas where we have more uncertainty from the ensemble. And we have indeed looked at this ensemble to make some evaluation of its performance compared to the recent past, as well as then look at what future projections this ensemble gives us. I'll show a few of those results now based on a paper we published last year, the year before. So here we're using the AWAP observations as our for our truth, and I'm going to show it using this stippling convention. When we look at the biases in the model, if you see just color with no stippling, then that's saying that the biases are not significant. If we see it colored but with stippling, that means that more than half the models had significant bias and they were mostly all in the same direction. So that means the observations are sort of near one side of the ensemble. It's probably the least desirable outcome. And lastly, if we have most of the models have significant biases, but they're split one way or the other, that's going to be shown in white. And that indicates that the observations lie sort of near the middle of our ensemble, but the biases can be large. So let's have a look at some of these results. First, we're looking at maximum daily temperature. We're looking at, on the left, annual, in the center, summer, and on the right, winter. And down the bottom, you can see the cordex ensemble result. So we have quite a bit of white areas. So while we have biases in our models, the observations lie near the middle of the ensemble. So that at least is good. Otherwise, we also have areas where we have a general cold bias in the ensemble. And you can see that that's stronger in winter than in summer. If we look at minimum temperatures, we have a different story. A lot of areas again are white, which is good, but when we do have the biases, we tend to be warm, have a warm bias in the ensemble. So the result here obviously is that our diurnal temperature range is smaller than in the observations in general in these models. And here our precipitation biases. So here you can see that we do have biases, particularly in Southern Australia, where we tend to be a bit too wet. Okay, so that's our biases. So keep that in mind when we look at our future changes. So what does this ensemble suggest for future changes for Australia? So here, similar to before, I've got minimum, maximum temperature, got the annual, summer, and the winter. Now the stippling is showing when the change into the future is significant. You can see the temperature changes are significant everywhere, all the time. And you can see that the minimum, maximum temperatures are increasing sort of 4 to 5 degrees more in Central Australia. and less near the coast. So maybe only 3 degrees or so near the coast. There is some difference between maximum and minimum temperature increases. Particularly, you can see that in the minimum temperature winter increases less for Southern Australia compared to the maximum temperature. Now we can look at precipitation, same kind of story. We can see that on an annual basis, overall, the only significant changes tend to be decreases in Southwest and Southeast Australia, and a bit of Eastern Australia there as well, sort of southern part of Queensland. Now this is split seasonally quite strongly, whereby in summer we tend to see a non-significant increase in rainfall over much of the country, whereas in winter we see this consistent decrease in rainfall. So most of that decrease is coming from a wintertime decrease in this ensemble. Okay, now we can also ask, do these regional projections add value to the global projections that we already have? So we know that some biases remain after downscaling. So are we adding value is a reasonable question to ask. So first, let's think a little bit about what we mean by add value. So when I say add value, I'm asking whether or not it improves our confidence in the simulated changes compared to the driving GCMs. Okay, so that's particularly when they differ. So there's two main things. So, well, there might be many different ways you could investigate this to decide if we're adding value, but two main things I'm going to propose here. And first is, do we better simulate the observed past climate than the GCM? So that would be an indicator that we're adding value if we're able to do that. But another one would be, you know, if we do this downscaling and the future projections are exactly the same as the global model, are we adding any value, or are we just wasting our time? You know, if the future projections are just the same, then we might as well have just used the global model, I guess. So what we want to do, both of these things have been addressed in the literature in a number of ways. Here we can propose a metric for added value, which is essentially the difference in the GCM errors and the RCM errors. Here the errors are written as root mean square errors. So it's simply the added value here would be positive if the RCM errors are smaller than the GCM errors. And when we're looking at future projections, we're looking for areas where the future change from the RCM is different to the future change from the GCM. So this has been referred to as potential added value. And in this case, you can see that if the future changes are projected are the same in the regional and the global models, then there's no potential added value in that case. So we decided we wanted a metric that would bring those two ideas together, called this metric the realized added value. We wanted to be able to calculate this on large ensembles. We wanted to calculate both the added value and potential added value. And we want it to be 0 if there's no added value or no potential added value. We also want it to be measured relative to interannual variability. So we wanted to have some way to assess whether the difference or the change or the amount of added value was actually important in an area. So the interannual variability is our measure of how big that change is relative to how important it is. And we also want this metric to be unitless so that we can compare across variables and across models. So here's the metric we came up with using the definitions for added value, potential added value that I showed just earlier. We essentially just normalize based on the variance of the interannual variance in the observations. Okay. We've published that in that paper down there. If you're interested, you can look at that for more. And so just to give you an idea of what this ends up looking like, here we're looking at the mean precipitation for summer and winter. So here on the left, we're just showing what the ensemble climate change prediction is in summer and winter. Here we're showing the potential added value. So where does this change differ from the global model projected change for the same place? You can see that in the color. Where that difference is significant is shown by the stippling. So you can see that this pattern is different from the change pattern itself. And then, so that's the potential added value in the center column. And then we calculate the realized added value by also bringing in our added value calculation on the observed past. And you get a realized added value picture that looks like this. So you can see if we look at summertime, for instance, we don't add value everywhere. So these gray and blackish areas are places we're not adding value. And the model ensemble doesn't add, where it does add value, it doesn't add the same amount of value everywhere. So you can see lots of value being added in these more central regions, and in these light red regions, less value being added. Of these missing area, these white spots, missing data areas, because of incomplete data in the AWAP observations. So you can see here in winter, again, we don't add value everywhere, and we tend to, there's less sort of overall added value compared to what we get in the summer up there. So that's just one example for one variable. You can do this for lots of different variables. You can do it for means, you can do it for extremes. So we did that. And then you can combine all those pictures of realized added value together into a single overall realized added value, and you get a picture that looks like this one here. So you can see, while for any individual model or individual variable, you may or may not add value in a particular location, combined together as an overall metric for the whole ensemble, we add value essentially everywhere in Australia. And you can see that we tend to add value around the coast, near the Great Dividing Range, and Tasmania. So that's not really a surprise. We know we're resolving the coastline and the topography better. So it's probably not a surprise that we add more value in those areas. So what else is available? So here's a picture showing not just the Cordex Australasia data, which covers the big area, but lots of other projects, mostly that have been funded by different states to downscale to higher resolution for those particular state-based areas. You can see a fairly long list of these projects here and the different domains that they cover here. So there is that one for Queensland. You're probably familiar with this. So this Queensland downscaling project is that you can get the data through the Queensland Future Climate Dashboard. There's the link there. And this is produced by using the CCAM model to downscale a suite of different CMIP5 GCMs. Here's just one example. I'm showing how the duration of droughts is changing based on this measure, the SBI 12-month SBI. And you can see, certainly for Eastern Queensland, there's a projection of an increase in drought duration by 27 under a high emission scenario, 2070 under a high emission scenario. All right, so what projections are planned for Australia? That's what's available right now. So what's planned? So, well, Cordex is moving on to downscaling CMIP6. There's some changes. Some things are the same as the previous round. So the Cordex Australasia domain extents are the same, for instance. We're downscaling CMIP6 models, and the resolutions are improving to this 12.5 to 25 kilometre range. The other main thing that changed is the emission scenarios. People are probably aware that CMIP6 is now changed to using these SSP scenarios. They are related to the CMIP5 RCP scenarios, but they are not the same. And here in this Cordex round, the priority scenarios are the SSP3 7.0 as the high emission scenario, and the SSP1 2.6 as the low emission scenario. So the SSP5 8.5, which is kind of like the RCP 8.5, which was the main scenario previously, is a secondary scenario in this round. This is following the IPCC report itself, which ends up using the SSP 370 as the main high emission scenario. For a number of reasons, this seems as a more likely scenario than SSP 585, and hence this is a experiment to look at what a very high but less likely scenario might be. It's probably worth noting that the RCP 8.5 scenario actually falls in between the SSP 585 and SSP 370. So this as a high scenario is not really a huge change from using RCP 8.5 in the previous round. There's also the state-based downscaling projects happening. The Queensland group has moved on to downscaling 76. They're downscaling to about 10-kilometre resolution over the Queensland area, and that work is underway. Another project I'm involved with New South Wales government, NARCLIM 2 is downscaling over that purple zone, where we'll be downscaling to about 4-kilometre resolution. And there's likely other downscaling efforts getting to these higher resolutions that will be happening in the coming years as well. So these efforts are underway at the moment. So the results from these will probably come online in the next year or two. Okay, so I'll just end with a few examples of using these projections. I'm going to cherry pick from my own publications, so I hope that's okay. But I have chosen a variety of ways we've been using this data. So I'll start with this study here. Now, this was an interesting study in that this study used data from all the different cordex domains around the world and then put them all together to give a single global picture of what's happening. In this case, they're looking at drought frequency using two different measures, SPI, which is based purely on rainfall, and SPEI, which is based on both rainfall changes and evapotranspiration changes. And essentially what you see here is if we look just with the rainfall changes, actually that's inconclusive for a lot of Australia, that's this hatching, but for some parts of Australia, we're seeing a slight decrease in frequency. But if we account also for changes in evapotranspiration, we see an increase in drought frequency for most of Australia. Here's another study where we used the NARCLIM regional projection ensemble to look at changes in potential for extreme wildfire. So essentially conditions conducive to pyrocumulonimbus production. And essentially what you can see here is, if I just get you to look at this right-hand column, is for Southeast Australia, we're seeing increases in the number of days with conditions conducive to pyrocumulonimbus production in spring. Here I'm looking at particularly in spring, on the order of sort of 2 to 5 days in spring, which is a increase of sort of maybe 20% in the number of days. So that's a potential fairly large likelihood of pyrocumulonimbus occurring. Here's another paper. We use the same ensemble. In this case, we're looking at the time windows available to do prescribed burning. Here you can see the results by month. In general, the result is a decrease in the chances of doing this in warm season, but an increase in the cool season. At the moment, for most of Southeast Australia, the prescribed burns might be done in April, May, and October. And you can see for many places, those times will become less available for prescribed burns. But times closer to the cool season become more available. So we might see the fire agencies have to shift the timing of when they try and do those burns from April, May to maybe May, June, and from October to a bit earlier in September, depending on where you are. Here was another study with a different set of collaborators where we were looking at future changes in hazelnut yields. So here we're using this regional climate data to drive agriculture models, particularly hazelnut in this case. And you can see this figure down here. It's fairly complicated. But we've broken the area of Southeast Australia into different agroclimatic zones. And you can see in the box plots in each case, the orange shows the future years, the blue, the present years. So for this one, you can see that we're getting an increase in yield in average, whereas for others, we're seeing a decrease in yield on average. And in these figures next to them, you can see where the groups of projections fall, grouping based on the driving GCM and what they're changing precipitation on the x-axis, temperature on the x-axis, precipitation on the x-axis, temperature on the y-axis, where they fall in that change and what that means for yield. So you can see for some of these southern zones, all the projections are giving us increases in yield, whereas for others, such as these northern zones up here, most of them are giving us declines in yields, in this case, except for the projection with the largest increase in rainfall. Still gives an increase. So there's a bit of a mix for those zones. So you can see with the regional projections, the regional variability in that projected future change can really make a difference depending on what impact you're looking at. Here's another one. This is just showing water demand in Sydney, and this green area here, a lot of water demand projected in the future is really driven by increases in population. When we do a large ensemble, we see that this green area are projections that show that the change because of the climate change was bigger than the change because of the population. So that was in this far future case, it's 35% of the time. So you have to include climate changes when you're thinking about things like changes in water demand. And last, just very quickly, this was just showing heat waves over urban areas. This is an east-west cross section through Sydney. Here's Sydney here, here's the ocean, here's the Blue Mountains, and you can see the urban landscape's impact on enhancing that heat anomaly during the heat wave over Sydney, really quite strongly, up to just over 1 kilometre up in the atmosphere. It's the sort of thing we can look at with these models. So there's my summary. I've gone a bit long, sorry about that. I'll leave that up for people to read, and I'll end there.
Great, thanks very much, Jason. That was fantastic.